One warm afternoon in early April 1959, a farmer walking his field outside Clear Lake, Iowa saw something glinting in the dirt. The snow that had covered the ground for the previous 2 months had finally melted, and the field was being turned for the spring planting for that year's corn crop. He bent down and picked up a mangled pair of horn-rimmed glasses. The glasses were delivered to the Cerro Gordy County Sheriff's Office, where they were placed in a manila envelope. They would not be seen again for 21 years. A quiet ending to a decade that had seen the birth of rock and roll. Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly. And this is the year that the rock and roll phenomenon that had exploded across America just a few years earlier almost died out from a run of events that ranged from the benign to the criminal. Rock and roll would survive, but it would not be the same music, and it would not be made by the same people. I'm Lauren Bregetzer, a professor at the University of Colorado Denver's College of Arts and Media, and on Everything is Gray, we try to make sense of something that's rarely simple, how the artists we admire and the things they've done shape the way we see their work and ourselves. This is the story of how rock and roll almost ended before it really got going. Not from one thing, but from 5. In the span of about 18 months, nearly every major figure who had built the genre was gone, dead, drafted, disgraced, indicted, or preaching. What filled the vacuum wasn't rock, and what eventually brought rock back wasn't even American. Those glasses in that envelope in Iowa were the last piece of the last man standing. By the time a farmer found them in the mud, rock and roll had already been losing its founders for over a year. This is how it happened. The noise before the quiet. To understand what got lost, you have to understand how new it all was. Rock and roll as a commercial phenomenon is barely 4 years old in 1958. You can argue about exactly when it starts. Some people point to Rocket 88 by Jackie Brenston in 1951. Some point to Bill Haley and Rockin' Around the Clock in 1954. Some point to the moment in July 1954 when a 19-year-old truck driver named Elvis Presley walked into Sun Studio in Memphis and recorded That's All Right in a single take. And Sam Phillips knew before the song was finished that he had something he had been looking for his entire career. Whatever date you pick, the music came from the same places. Black rhythm and blues, country, and gospel, the kind of dance music people made in juke joints in Mississippi and on porches in Tennessee. None of it was new on its own. What was new was that white teenagers were buying it. White teenagers had money for the first time in American history, because the post-war economy had given their parents jobs, and the parents had given their kids allowances, and the kids were spending those allowances on 45s, transistor radios, and dance hall tickets. A whole new market had appeared almost overnight, and the music it wanted was loud and fast and black and southern. The thing the parents noticed first, and the thing the parents hated most, was that the music was integrated, not just in who was making it, but in who was listening. White kids were buying records by black artists, showing up at concerts where black and white musicians played the same bill and dancing in the same rooms. In 1956, in much of the country, this was a genuine emergency. Sermons were preached against it. City councils banned concerts. Newspaper editorials warned that rock and roll was corrupting the youth, which is a phrase that sounds funny now, but it was treated at the time as a real social problem. Sam Phillips, who ran Sun Records and discovered Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis and Carl Perkins, said it years later in a way nobody else would say it out loud at the time. He said the people who came after him had accused him of causing white people to love black music. He even used an uglier word for it. The point is that the backlash against rock and roll was never really about the music. It was about who was making it and who was listening to it. And the fact that those two groups were sitting in the same rooms. By the fall of 1957, that backlash had not stopped any of it. The records kept selling, the crowds kept growing, and the 5 men who built that genre were all, in their different ways, at the top of their powers. Elvis Presley was the biggest star in the world. Hits like Heartbreak Hotel, Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, and Jailhouse Rock. He had 4 #1 singles in 1956 alone. He had been on Ed Sullivan 3 times, and the 3rd time he was so famous that Sullivan had to publicly vouch for his character on camera, calling him a fine, decent boy in the hope that parents would calm down. They did not calm down, but the records kept selling anyway. Little Richard was the wildest of the 5. Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, Good Golly Miss Molly. He performed an eyeliner and a 6-inch pompadour, screaming at the top of his lungs. He pounded the piano with his foot up on the bench. He He was openly queer in a way that 1950s America had no language for, and no interest in protecting, and he was black, and he was from Macon, Georgia, and somehow he had become one of the most recognizable performers in the country. Specialty Records could not press his records fast enough. Chuck Berry was a songwriter. Maybelline, Roll Over Beethoven, School Day, Rock and Roll Music, Johnny B. Good was coming in 1958. Berry was the man who figured out how to write about being a teenager for teenagers. Cars, schools, and girls. The clock waiting for 3 o'clock to come. His guitar figures were the grammar that every rock song after him would be written in. If you have ever heard a rock and roll guitar solo, you have heard Chuck Berry whether you knew it or not. Jerry Lee Lewis was Sun Records' answer to losing Elvis. After RCA bought Elvis's contract from Sam Phillips in 1955, Phillips went looking for the next one, and he found Jerry Lee in 1956. A 21-year-old piano player from Faraday, Louisiana, with a voice like a tent revival and a stage manner like a man trying to fight his instrument. Whole Lot of Shakin' Going On was a number 3 pop hit in the summer of 1957. Great Balls of Fire was a number 2 hit that fall. By December of 1957, Sam Phillips genuinely believed that Jerry Lee Lewis was going to be bigger than Elvis, and so did a lot of other people. And Buddy Holly was the quiet one, the craftsman. He was 21 years old from Lubbock, Texas, and he was doing things in the studio that none of the others were doing. He was writing his own songs, which in 1957 was unusual. He was producing his own records, which was almost unheard of. He used the recording studio as an instrument, layering guitars, double-tracking his own vocals, treating each song as a small piece of architecture. That'll Be the Day, Peggy Sue, and Oh Boy. If you wanted to know what rock and roll was going to sound like in 1965, you could already hear it on a Buddy Holly record in 1957. He just didn't know that yet, and neither did anybody else. Those were the 5. In the fall of 1957, all of them were at the top of their powers. Elvis was filming Jailhouse Rock. Little Richard was on tour in Australia. Chuck Berry was watching rock and roll music climb the charts. Jerry Lee Lewis had just released Great Balls of Fire. Buddy Holly and the Crickets were about to tour the United Kingdom, where a 16-year-old in Liverpool named John Lennon would watch them play and decide what he wanted to do with his life. Within 18 months, 4 of those 5 men would be out of the music business, and the 5th would be dead. The Falls. It started with the wildest one. In October 1957, Little Richard was on tour in Australia. The tour was huge, stadium shows and screaming crowds. Reports of fans tearing at his clothes and being dragged out of the audience by the police. He was 24 years old and arguably the most exciting live performer in the world. He was also, by his own later account, exhausted, frightened of his own success, and increasingly tormented by the gap between what he was on stage and what he believed about God. The story he told for the rest of his life is that he was on a small plane flying between shows when one of the engines appeared to catch fire. He looked out the window and saw what he believed were angels holding the wings up. He prayed, and then the plane landed safely. A few days later, crossing Sydney Harbor by ferry, he took 4 diamond rings off his fingers and threw them into the water as an offering to God. Then he announced to the press that he was quitting rock and roll. He told them that if you wanted to live for the Lord, you could not rock and roll too. He canceled the rest of the tour and flew home to the United States. He enrolled in Oakland College in Alabama to study the ministry. The wildest performer in rock and roll, at the absolute peak of his career, was gone. Specialty Record had what was in the vault, and they kept releasing it. Good Golly Miss Molly came out in January 1958 and reached number 10. It was the last real hit of his original run. By the middle of 1958, he was preaching full-time, recording gospel, touring revival meetings with Mahalia Jackson. The man who had screamed a wop-a-loo-bop a lop bam boom into a microphone in 1955 was now reading scripture from a pulpit in Alabama. 2 things can be true about Little Richard's conversion. The first, that it was sincere. He really did preach what he believed. He spent the next several years preaching, and he really did cycle in and out of the church for the rest of his life, never fully at peace with either world. The second is that the conversion was tangled up with things he couldn't say out loud in 1957. He was black, and he was queer. He was performing a version of himself on stage that the country had no place for offstage. The conversion was a real spiritual experience, and was also a way out of a life that was costing him something the public never saw. Both things are true. He spent the rest of his life trying to hold them at once, but never quite figured out how. In October 1957, the first of the 5 was gone. He took himself out. Nobody else would have that luxury. The second one took himself out too, but he didn't know he was doing it. In 1957, 2 months after Little Richard threw his rings into Sydney Harbor, Jerry Lee Lewis got married. He was 22 years old. The bride was his first cousin once removed, a girl named Myra Gale Brown, and she was 13. There is no version of that sentence that gets easier the more you look at it. She was 13, and he was 22. He was also still legally married to his second wife at the time, which made the new marriage bigamous on top of everything else. The wedding happened quietly in Mississippi, where the laws around child marriage were loose enough that nobody asked too many questions if the parents signed off. For about 5 months, almost nobody outside Jerry Lee's immediate circle knew about it. He kept touring and he kept recording. Great Balls of Fire was still on the charts. Sam Phillips was still telling everyone that would listen that Jerry Lee was going to be the next Elvis. In May 1958, Jerry Lee flew to London for a major British tour. 71 shows in 6 weeks. The biggest international break of his career, and he brought Myra with him. A reporter from the Daily Mail named Paul Tanfield met the plane at Heathrow and saw a young girl standing next to Jerry Lee. He asked her who she was, and she said, "I'm Jerry's wife." He asked how old she was. Jerry Lee, standing next to her, said 15. She was actually 13. The British press came apart at the seams. The Daily Mail ran the story on the front page the next morning. Within 24 hours, every paper in the country was running headlines about the American hillbilly rock star and his child bride. The fact that Jerry Lee was still technically married to his second wife came out almost immediately, which made the story a bigamy scandal on top of a child marriage scandal. Theaters started canceling shows. The tour, which was supposed to run 6 weeks, was over after 3 performances. Jerry Lee and Myra flew home. By the time they landed in New York, the American industry had caught up with the story. Dick Clark dropped him from American Bandstand. Radio stations stopped playing his records. Sun Records, which had been pushing him as the next big thing, quietly stopped promoting him. Sam Phillips took out a full-page ad in Billboard signed by Jerry Lee himself, trying to undo the timing of the divorce and the marriage, and it didn't help. The advertisement could not undo the photograph. Within weeks, Jerry Lee's concert fee fell from around $10,000 a night to about $100,000. He went from headlining stadiums to playing roadhouses in Mississippi. His single stopped charting, and he didn't have another major pop hit for almost a decade. He eventually rebuilt a career in country music in the late 1960s, and the music business, which has always been willing to make room for talented men no matter what they've done, made room for him again. But the rock and roll career, the one where he was going to be the next Elvis, was over before he turned 23. The Jerry Lee Lewis story is the hardest one in this episode to write honestly, and you shouldn't try too hard to make it easier than it is. The press coverage was hypocritical. The British outrage was partly about class and accent and Americanness as much as it was about the actual marriage. The American industry's sudden moral awakening was very convenient given that they had been happy to look the other way for years. All of those things are true, and it's also true that he married a 13-year-old. Myra herself, decades later, gave interviews defending him and saying that she had been the adult in the marriage, which is kind of its own heartbreak. In 1957, Little Richard was gone by his own choice. By June 1958, Jerry Lee Lewis was gone by his own hand. 2 of the 5 in 8 months, and the biggest one had not even left yet. Elvis got his draft notice in December 1957. He was 22 years old, the most famous entertainer in the world, and there was a piece of paper telling him to report for duty. He could have asked for a deferment, plenty of other people in that situation would have. He could have joined the Special Services, which was the Army's entertainment branch, and spent 2 years putting on shows for the troops. The Army actually offered him this. Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, encouraged him to take it, but Elvis turned it down. He wanted to serve as a regular soldier. Some of that was Parker's longer game. The calculation that a clean-cut soldier Elvis would be worth more in the long run than a Special Services Elvis. Some of it was Elvis himself, who seems to have actually believed that taking the regular path was the right thing to do. He was the son of a poor family from Tupelo. He had grown up patriotic, so he didn't want special treatment. On March 24, 1958, he reported for induction in Memphis. Photographers were everywhere. The Army cut his hair on camera. The most famous head of hair in America hit the floor of a barbershop in front of the world. He smiled through it all and said all the right things. He shipped out for basic training, and in October, he was sent to Germany where he would stay until March of 1960. For 2 years, the biggest star in the world was not making music, not touring, and not appearing on television. RCA Records, which had seen this coming, had stockpiled recordings before he left. They rationed them out carefully over the 2 years he was away. New singles kept appearing, including Hard-Headed Woman and A Big Hunk of Love, but there were no new sessions and no new performances. No new Elvis. The cultural space that he had occupied was suddenly empty. Elvis is the easiest of the five to handle because his absence was temporary and he did come back. But two things are worth saying about it. The first is that Elvis who came back in 1960 was not the Elvis who had left. The Army and Parker and the years away smoothed him out. The dangerous Elvis of 1956, the one who scared Ed Sullivan into shooting him from the waist up, was gone. What came back was a movie star and a balladeer. Some of that was a natural growth, and some of it was strategy. And some of it was the cultural moment that had created the dangerous Elvis was gone too. The second thing worth saying is harder. It was during these years in Germany that Elvis met a 14-year-old girl named Priscilla Beaulieu. She was the daughter of an Air Force captain stationed near him. He was 24. They began what Elvis and the people around him described as a courtship, and what almost any honest description today would call something else. She would eventually move into Graceland while she was still a teenager. They married in 1967 when she was 21. The story has been told for 60 years in the gentlest possible language. The press at the time mostly chose not to tell it at all, partly because the Jerry Lee Lewis disaster was still fresh and the industry had no appetite for a second one. The double standard is its own piece of evidence about how machinery worked and who got protected from their own choices and who did not. Of the five founders, Elvis is the only one that got to come back. He's also the one that came back into a world that no longer needed him to define it, partly because he himself was no longer in the room to shape what it became. By the winter of 1959, with Little Richard preaching, Jerry Lee Lewis blacklisted, and Elvis in Germany, Buddy Holly was one of the last original waves still actively touring. He was 22 years old. He had recently broken with his producer Norman Petty over money and was, despite his hits, almost broke. His wife Maria Elena was pregnant with their first child and he needed work. The work he took was a package tour through the upper Midwest in the dead of winter called the Winter Dance Party. The lineup included Holly, Richie Valens, J.P. Richardson, also known as the Big Bopper, Dion and the Belmonts, and a young guitarist named Tommy Alsop playing in Holly's backing band. The tour was a logistical disaster from the first night. The buses were old and unheated. The schedule was also punishing. The drive between Green Bay and Clear Lake was something like 400 miles in temperatures that fell below zero. One of the drummers got frostbite so badly that he had to be hospitalized. The musicians were exhausted, sick, and cold. On February 2nd, 1959, the tour played the Surf Ballroom in Clear Lake, Iowa. After the show, Buddy Holly decided he'd had enough. He chartered a small plane to fly himself and a couple of bandmates to the next stop in Moorhead, Minnesota, so they could get some sleep, do laundry, and arrive at the next venue rested. The plane was a Beechcraft Bonanza. It had 3 passenger seats plus the pilot. One of the seats went to Holly. The other 2 were not supposed to go to Valens or the Big Bopper. They were supposed to go to Holly's backing band. Waylon Jennings, who was playing bass on the tour, gave up his seat to the Big Bopper, who had the flu and was suffering on the bus. Tommy Alsop lost his seat to Richie Valens on a coin flip. Alsop later spent the rest of his life thinking about that coin. The plane took off just after 1 in the morning on February 3rd, 1959. The pilot was a 21-year-old named Roger Peterson. He was not certified for instrument flying, which meant he was not legally qualified to fly in conditions where he could not see the horizon. The weather that night was worse than he had been told. Within minutes of takeoff, in the dark and the snow, Peterson lost control of the plane. It hit the ground in a cornfield about 5 miles from the airport, going somewhere around 170 miles per hour. All 4 people on board died on impact. Buddy Holly was 22 years old. Richie Valens was 17. The Big Bopper was 28, and Roger Peterson was 21. The wreckage was found at first light. The bodies were recovered and the personal effects were cataloged and returned to families. But Holly's glasses, which had been knocked from his face on impact, was thrown clear of the wreckage. Those were not found. They were still out there in the field, under the snow, where they would stay for 2 more months, until a farmer turning the soil for spring planting picked them up. The story everyone knows about that night is the one Don McLean would write 12 years later, the one about the day the music died. The story is right about almost everything except the date. The music had not been dying on February 3rd, 1959. The music had been dying for 15 months by then. Little Richard had walked away from it. Jerry Lee Lewis had been blacklisted from it, and Elvis had been drafted out of it. And Buddy Holly was almost the last man standing. The reason his death felt like an ending was not because it was the first loss. It was because there was almost nothing left for it to interrupt. Holly was 22 years old, and his son was born 7 months after his death. His glasses sat in an envelope for 21 years. And of the 5 men who built rock and roll, 4 were now gone, and a 5th was about to be indicted. Chuck Berry in the winter of 1959 was in some real sense the last man standing. Richard was preaching, Lewis was blacklisted, Elvis was in Germany, and Holly was dead. Chuck Berry was still recording, still touring, and still writing the songs the next generation of rock musicians would learn note for note. He was 33 years old, black, successful, and openly enjoying the success in ways that made a lot of people in 1959 America deeply uncomfortable. In December 1959, Berry was indicted under the Mann Act. The Mann Act was a federal law passed in 1910 ostensibly to fight prostitution, which made it a crime to transport a woman or a girl across state lines for what the statute called immoral purposes. The law had a long and ugly history almost from the moment it was written. It had been used almost from the beginning as a tool to prosecute interracial relationships and to harass black men who had become too successful or too visible. Jack Johnson, the heavyweight boxing champion, had been convicted under it in 1913 for traveling with his white girlfriend. The pattern was old and well known. The specific accusation against Berry was that he had brought a 14-year-old girl named Janice Escalante from Texas to Missouri to work as a hat check girl at his nightclub in St. Louis, and he had then had a sexual relationship with her. The facts of the case were genuinely contested. The girl's testimony shifted over the course of the proceedings. The circumstances of how she had been in St. Louis and what she was doing before, what her relationship with Berry had actually been, all of it was disputed. There were two trials. The first, in 1960, ended in a conviction. The conviction was thrown out on appeal because the trial judge had made openly racist comments from the bench, including referring to Berry as this Negro repeatedly during the proceedings, and my apologies for the language. The appeals court found that the judge's behavior had made a fair trial impossible, so they ordered a new trial. The second trial in 1961 also ended in a conviction. Berry was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison and a $10,000 fine. He appealed, but he lost. He reported to federal prison in February 1962. Berry served about 20 months and was released in October 1963. This segment here really requires a lot of care, because two things can be true at the same time. The first is that the prosecution of Chuck Berry was racially motivated in ways that were not subtle. The first judge was openly racist on the record, which is the rarest kind of evidence which the appeals court itself acknowledged. The Mann Act had been used against black men for 50 years. Berry was a successful black entertainer with a white wife and a nightclub in a city that didn't love him or any of those things. A white rock star with the same set of facts would almost certainly not have been prosecuted. And if he had been, he would not have been convicted twice. And if he had been convicted, he would not have had to serve 20 months in federal prison. The second thing that is true is that the underlying allegation involved a 14-year-old girl, and the fact that the prosecution was racist does not automatically make the underlying conduct okay. Two things can be true at the same time. The system that prosecuted Chuck Berry was rigged against him because he was black, and the conduct it was prosecuting may not have been innocent. We don't fully know what happened. The people who did know are mostly dead. The historical record has been shaped from the beginning by people with strong reasons to tell it one way or another, and the honest answer is we're not going to get to the bottom of it from where we're sitting now. But what we do know is that by the time Chuck Berry reported to federal prison in February 1962, all 5 of the men who built rock and roll were gone. One was preaching, one was playing roadhouses for $100 a night, one was making movies in Hollywood, one was buried in Lubbock, and one was inmate number whatever in a federal facility in Indiana. The genre they had invented less than a decade earlier no longer had any of its investors in it. What happened next is the part of the story you have to understand if you want to understand anything about the 1960s. What filled the vacuum? By the spring of 1959, the music industry had a problem. Teenagers still wanted music, records still had to ship, and radio still had to fill airtime. American Bandstand still had to put bodies on the dance floor every weekday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Somebody had to be the new Elvis. The question was, who got to decide? The answer the industry came up with was not weaker rock and roll. It was a different product entirely, designed by different people for different reasons. The prototype was a clean-cut white singer from Tennessee named Pat Boone. Boone had been making a career out of covering black artists since 1955. Ain't That a Shame was a Fats Domino song before it was a Pat Boone song. Tutti Frutti was a Little Richard song before Boone ever got a hold of it. The Boone versions were slower, smoother, and wider, and they outsold the originals on the pop charts because radio stations that wouldn't play a black artist would play a white kid from Tennessee covering the same song. This wasn't an accident, it was a business model. By the end of the 1950s, Pat Boone had sold something like 45 million records, most of them sanded down covers of music made by black men who were not allowed on the same radio stations. Little Richard used to say that Pat Boone's version of Tutti Frutti paid for his swimming pool because Richard owned the publishing for that song. Whether or not that exact line is literally true, it captures something real. The covers were a kind of laundering, and the original artist sometimes got paid and sometimes did not, depending on who controlled the rights, and that's a different story. If Pat Boone was the prototype, Fabian was what the system looked like when it had fully matured. The story of Fabian Fort was almost too perfect. He was discovered in 1958 at age 14, sitting on the front steps of his house in South Philadelphia. The man who discovered him was a record executive named Bob Marcucci, who was looking, openly, for a good-looking kid he could turn into a teen idol. Fabian couldn't really sing. Marcucci had him take lessons. The label built a stage persona, picked his songs, dressed him, coached him, and put him on American Bandstand. Within a year, he had 3 top 10 hits. The point is not that Fabian was untalented or that his fans were fooled. The point is that the entire industry process was inverted. With the original rockers, the music came first and the industry followed. With Fabian, the industry came first and the music was assembled around a face. Rock and roll had been something that bubbled up out of Memphis and New Orleans and Macon and St. Louis. Teen pop was something that got manufactured in Philadelphia and then shipped out. Frankie Avalon, Fabian, Bobby Rydell, Chubby Checker, and Connie Francis. All of them came out of the same small set of producers and labels. Most of them were Philadelphia kids. Most of them were managed or developed by the same handful of people. American Bandstand was filmed in Philadelphia. Dick Clark was based in Philadelphia. And the whole thing was a closed loop. And the loop ran through one studio in West Philadelphia where teenagers danced on television every weekday afternoon. Dick Clark is a central figure of this part of the story, and he's worth taking seriously. Because he isn't a villain in the obvious sense. He was charming, smart, hardworking, and genuinely good at what he did. He also happened to be standing exactly where the money was at exactly the moment where the money got concentrated. And he made decisions that benefited him personally in ways that, if anybody else had made them, would have ended their careers. American Bandstand went national on ABC in August 1957. By 1959, it was the single most successful promotional vehicle in American pop music. An appearance on Bandstand could turn a regional record into a national hit overnight. Not appearing on Bandstand meant your record was probably going to die. Clark was the one who decided who got on. He decided what got played, which dance crazes got featured, and which didn't. He had, functionally, veto power of what the American teenagers heard. He also had financial stakes in a lot of what he was promoting. He owned pieces of record labels, including Swan Records. He had publishing interests in songs that he played on his show. He had management pieces of artists that he featured. By his own later admission, he was financially involved in something like 150 different music industry entities by the end of the 1950s. When a song he had a stake in did well on Bandstand, Clark made money on it directly. The conflict of interest was not subtle and it wasn't hidden. It was simply the way that business worked at the time. And the public image of Dick Clark in 1959 was the opposite of all of this. He was the wholesome young host, the world's oldest teenager. He was the man parents trusted to look after their kids' record collections. The contrast between the image and the reality is the whole story of what filled the vacuum in miniature. The music industry presented itself as a safe alternative to the dangerous music it had replaced. The reality was that the business at the time was running a much more efficient extraction operation than anything Sun Records or Specialty ever attempted. The wildness was gone, and so was most of the money that used to flow to the artists. In late 1959, in the wake of the quiz show scandals that embarrassed the television networks, Congress decided to investigate corruption in broadcasting. The Senate Subcommittee on Legislative Oversight turned its attention to payola in early 1960. Hearings ran through the spring. Dozens of disc jockeys were called to testify. Payola was the practice of record labels paying disc jockeys to play their records on air, and had been going on for decades. Everyone in the industry knew about it. The hearings were partly about cleaning up the industry and partly about finding a target the public could hate. And the target the hearings ended up producing was not the industry itself, but it was one man. Alan Freed is the name to know. He was the disc jockey who, depending on who you ask, either coined the term rock and roll or popularized it. He'd been broadcasting black rhythm and blues to white teenagers in Cleveland since the early 1950s. He then moved to New York, where he hosted the most influential rock radio show in the country and ran live concerts that featured black and white artists on the same bill in front of integrated audiences. He was loud, flamboyant, Jewish, and unapologetic about championing black music. He was also, like every other DJ of his era, taking money from record labels. When the hearings came for him, Freed refused to sign an affidavit denying that he had ever taken payola. He said he had received what he called consulting fees and gifts, but that they had never influenced what he played. That distinction didn't save him. He was fired from WABC in November 1959. He was indicted on commercial bribery charges in 1960. He pleaded guilty in 1962 and was given a suspended sentence and a $300 fine. He was indicted again on tax evasion in 1964. He died in 1965, broke and broken, from complications of alcoholism. He was only 43 years old. Dick Clark testified before the same hearings. He was, by almost every objective measure, more financially entangled with the music industry than Alan Freed ever had been. He had ownership stakes that Freed never had. He had publishing pieces that Freed never had. He had, in pure dollar terms, made vastly more money from his industry connections than Freed ever did. The hearings called him the single most influential person in the popular music business and meant it as a description of a problem. And nothing happened to him. He divested some of his holdings under pressure from ABC. He testified carefully and politely. He kept his job, and American Bandstand stayed on the air. He went on to host the show for another 30 years, plus the New Year's Eve specials, plus the game shows, plus the Lifetime Achievement Awards. He died in 2012 as one of the most beloved figures in American broadcasting. Two things can be true here as well. The payola hearings were a real attempt to address a real problem, and they were also a mechanism for choosing which kind of person got to keep operating in the music industry and which did not. Alan Freed was flamboyant, integrationist, loyal to black artists, and culturally suspect in ways that 1959 America had a lot of vocabulary for. Dick Clark was clean-cut, white bread, corporate, and culturally legible. One of them got destroyed, and the other got a television empire. The mechanism that chose between them is the same mechanism that's been choosing between people in American culture for as long as American culture has existed. The business sacrifices the person who was making it uncomfortable, and it calls that sacrifice a moral cleanup. You can hear what the music sounded like after the cleanup if you go back and look at the year-end Billboard charts. In 1956, the year-end top 10 included Elvis Presley, the Platters, Dean Martin, and Little Richard's Long Tall Sally sitting in the middle of the list like an unexploded bomb. By 1960, the year-end number one song was Percy Faith's Theme from a Summer Place, an orchestral instrumental that spent 9 weeks at the top of the Hot 100. The rest of the year-end top 10 was Connie Francis, Brenda Lee, Jim Reeves, and Elvis movie ballads. By 1962, the year-end number one was Stranger on the Shore, a clarinet instrumental by a British jazz musician named Acker Bilk. There's nothing wrong with Stranger on the Shore. It's a perfectly nice piece of music, but it's not what was on the charts in 1956. And the distance between the two charts is the distance the industry has traveled in 6 years. That should have been the end of the story. The original artists were gone. The replacements were in place. The pipeline was running, and the institution had won. Except that 3,000 miles away, something was happening that nobody in Philadelphia or New York or Los Angeles was paying attention to. The records that the American industry had decided were too dangerous, too black, too southern, too rough to keep promoting were being bought by mail and by import by teenagers in places like Liverpool and London and Newcastle. Those teenagers were taking the records home, they were putting them on, and they were learning the songs by heart. The rescue was already loading. July 6, 1957. At church fete at St. Peter's in the village of Woolton, on the outskirts of Liverpool, a skiffle band called the Quarrymen is playing in the afternoon. The band's leader is a 16-year-old named John Lennon, and the audience is a 15-year-old named Paul McCartney who had come along with a friend. After the set, McCartney is introduced to Lennon backstage. He picks up a guitar, he tunes it, which Lennon notes with some interest because Lennon doesn't really know how to tune a guitar at that time. And then McCartney launches into a version of Long Tall Sally by Little Richard. He does the screaming, he does the whole thing. Lennon, who had been trying to figure out how anyone gets that sound out of a human throat, watches a 15-year-old do it in front of him in a church hall in the suburbs of Liverpool. A few weeks later, Lennon invites McCartney to join the band. The Beatles, in the form they would eventually take, began at that moment. A few weeks later, Lennon invites McCartney to join the band. The Beatles, in the form they would eventually take, began at that moment. 3 months after that afternoon in Woolton, on the other side of the world, Little Richard is on a plane over Australia, watching what he believes are angels holding up the wings, deciding to quit rock and roll forever. The kid who had saved the music was already learning it from the man who was about to walk away from it. They were on opposite sides of the world. They didn't know each other existed. The handoff was already happening and neither of them knew it. That is how it went all over Britain for the next several years. While the American industry was busy replacing Little Richard with Pat Boone, kids in British cities were buying imported American records. The records the American industry had moved past, and they were learning them in their bedrooms, note by note. The records they were buying were not the new American hits. They were the old ones, like Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, and Carl Perkins. The records that had been quietly written out of the official American story were the records the British kids were treating like sacred texts. The Beatles named themselves after Buddy Holly's band, the Crickets. That's not a coincidence. It's a tribute in the loose sense. It's a direct statement of lineage. Their early sets were full of Holly covers. John Lennon said for the rest of his life that Holly was the reason he wrote his own songs, because Holly had shown him a rock and roll musician could also be a songwriter, which in 1957 was not the assumption. The model the Beatles built their entire career on, the singer-songwriter band that wrote and performed its own material, came directly from Buddy Holly. The Rolling Stones started as a Chuck Berry cover band. That's also not an exaggeration. Their first single was a Chuck Berry song. Their early sets were almost entirely Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters covers. Keith Richards has said in roughly 9,000 interviews that everything he knows about playing rock and roll guitar he learned from Chuck Berry records. The famous story of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards meeting on the train platform in Dartford in October 1961 is a story about two teenagers recognizing each other because one of them is carrying a Chuck Berry album under his arm and the other one knew what it was. The album was an import. You couldn't easily buy Chuck Berry records in England in 1961. You had to know someone or order them by mail or get lucky at a specialty shop. The kids who became the Stones were the kids that went to that trouble. And Paul McCartney never stopped doing his Little Richard impression. The thing he had taught himself in his bedroom at 14, the screaming and the wail, the way Richard could go from a low growl to a high scream inside a single syllable, became one of the signature sounds of the early Beatles. Listen to Long Tall Sally on the Beatles' 1964 EP. Listen to I'm Down from 1965. Listen to the screaming on Helter Skelter 3 years later. That's McCartney doing Little Richard, and he never stopped doing it because he never had to. When the Beatles toured with Little Richard in 1962, after Richard had come back to secular music for the first time, McCartney essentially apprenticed himself. He spent hours backstage asking Richard how he did the screams, how he hit the high notes, how he got the wail in his voice. Richard, by all accounts, was generous with him. He showed the kid how it worked. A few years later, McCartney was on Ed Sullivan in front of 73 million people, doing what Little Richard had taught him in front of an audience that had largely forgotten that Richard existed. That is the rescue and the wound in the same paragraph. McCartney loved Richard. He learned from him. He honored him in interviews for the rest of his life. And he also, by the timing and the cultural mood of 1964, ended up inheriting the cultural space that should have been Richard's. While all of this was happening, the Beatles were apprenticing themselves in a different way too. Between 1960 and 1962, they spent something like 2 years playing brutal multi-set nights in Hamburg clubs, doing 5 and 6 hours a night, learning their craft on the bandstand the way the original American rockers had learned theirs. This is the part of the Beatles story that the cleaned-up version usually skips, because it is dirty and exhausting, and involves amphetamines, bad food, and worse sleep. But it's the part that matters, because it's where the band became a band. They played hundreds of nights, they learned to hold an audience for hours, they built a repertoire of American covers that they could deploy at any tempo and any volume. And the parallel here is worth saying out loud. The American Teen Idol machine was producing singers who could not really sing, backed by session musicians, performing songs written by professionals on a television show filmed in Philadelphia. The British scene was producing bands who had played 5,000 hours together in beer-soaked German clubs, writing their own material, learning from records that the USA had already abandoned. When those two systems collided in 1964, it was not really a fair fight. February 7th, 1964. The Beatles land at Kennedy Airport in New York. There are screaming teenagers waiting at the airport, which the press treats as a spontaneous phenomenon, which was, in fact, partly engineered by Capitol Records, who had finally figured out what they had on their hands and spent real money on the rollout. 2 days later, the Beatles play The Ed Sullivan Show. 73 million people watched. It was, at the time, the largest television audience in American history. The thing to point out gently is what they played. The Ed Sullivan set list included All My Loving, I Saw Her Standing There, and She Loves You, all Beatles originals. But it also included Till There Was You, a show tune from The Music Man, which is the song their manager Brian Epstein had insisted they play to show American parents that the boys were respectable. The Beatles arrived in America already understanding the rules of the game the American industry had been playing. They knew they had to be both wild and safe. They'd been studying that balance for years. What happened in the next 18 months was one of the fastest cultural transfers in pop music history. The Stones came over later in 1964. The Animals, the Kinks, the Who, Herman's Hermits, and the Dave Clark Five. By 1965, the American charts were dominated by British bands playing American music back to America, often the exact American music that the American music industry had decided was too dangerous to keep making in 1958. Roll Over Beethoven was a top 40 hit in America in 1964, sung by the Beatles. The original by Chuck Berry had come out in 1956. The song had to leave the country and come back with a Liverpool accent before American radio would play it again. The rescue was real, and the rescue was not the same thing as a restoration. What happened to each? For the five founders, the British invasion did different things, and for some of them it was too late. Little Richard wanted to come back to secular music in the early 1960s, partly because he saw what was happening and wanted to be part of it. He toured with the Beatles in 1962 before they were famous. By 1964, they were bigger than he was. He spent the rest of the 1960s and 1970s in a long, painful cycle of secular comebacks and religious withdrawals, never quite finding the place he'd occupied in 1956. He was rediscovered in waves by each new generation, but he was never the cultural force he had been at his peak. He lived until 2020. Little Richard was recognized as a foundational figure, but he never really got to be a star in the way that he was in those 18 months in the mid-1950s. Jerry Lee Lewis got a country career in the late 1960s and became, on his own terms, a country music legend. Another Place, Another Time hit number 4 in the country charts in 1968. He kept recording and performing the rest of his life. He was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in its first class of 1986. He outlived almost everyone else in this story, dying in 2022 at the age of 87. The music business made room for him again because the music business has always been willing to make room for monumentally talented men, and the things that ended his rock and roll career in 1958 were quietly placed in the past by people who decided to stop talking about them. Elvis is one for whom the British invasion was, in some ways, a disaster. He spent most of the 1960s making increasingly bad movies under Colonel Tom Parker's management. He watched the Beatles eclipse him and reportedly took it badly. The infamous 1968 comeback special was, in part, his attempt to remind the world that he had been there first. It worked briefly. He got a few more years of being Elvis again before the long Las Vegas decline. He died in 1977 at the age of 42. Buddy Holly is the one for whom the rescue was simultaneously the most complete and the most heartbreaking. His influence on the music of the 1960s is so total that you can draw a straight line from That'll Be the Day to almost every guitar pop record for the next decade. The Beatles, the Hollies, who were named after him, Bob Dylan, the Byrds, all of them were working in a new language that Holly had invented. Buddy Holly never got to know any of it. His son grew up in a world where his father was a legend the boy had never met. And Chuck Berry is the one whose rescue was the most direct and the most bitter. He got out of prison in October 1963. By 1964, the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan playing his songs. He recorded a few new singles in 1964 that became hits, songs like No Particular Place to Go and You Never Can Tell. Great records, and they sold, in part because every British band in the world was now telling interviewers that Chuck Berry was a genius. He had a long and weird career after that. He played oldies tours and he got into fights with promoters. He got in trouble with the IRS. He even got in trouble for installing cameras in the bathrooms of his restaurant, which is not the kind of thing you can write off as a misunderstanding. Chuck Berry kept performing in his 80s. He died in 2017 at the age of 90. The two things that could be true about Chuck Berry stayed true for the rest of his life. He invented a huge portion of the language of rock and roll, and he was a man with a long history of behavior we should not look away from. The music business made room for him too, because of course it did. By 1965, rock and roll was bigger than it had ever been. Bigger than 1956. Bigger than anything the original founders had imagined. The British invasion had not just rescued the music, it had expanded it into a global phenomenon that would dominate the next 20 years of pop culture. By any measure that the music industry cares about, the story had a happy ending. But the music industry's measures are not the only measures. The glasses. The glasses sat in that manila envelope in the Cerro Gordo County Sheriff's Office for 21 years. They were rediscovered in 1980, when a clerk going through the old evidence found them and recognized what they were. By the time they came out of the envelope, the world they had belonged to was almost unrecognizable. Buddy Holly's son was 21 years old, the same age his father had been when he died. The Beatles had formed and conquered the world and broken up. John Lennon had been shot in front of the apartment building in New York the same year. Elvis was 3 years dead. Little Richard had cycled through 3 or 4 more conversions and comebacks. Jerry Lee Lewis was a country music elder statesman. Chuck Berry was on the oldies circuit playing the same 12 songs night after night for audience that exactly wanted to hear that. The glasses were the same. Everything around them had changed. This episode has been about how rock and roll almost died and about the 5 men who were taken out of it one by one in 18 months, and about what the industry built in that empty space they left behind. But it has also been about something older than rock and roll, and something that didn't stop happening when the Beatles landed at JFK. It has been about the way that the business responds to the loss of their wildest people. About what gets sacrificed and what gets protected. About who gets to come back and who doesn't. About the difference between defending the music and defending the business that grows up around the music, and about which of those two things the institution is actually built to defend. None of the people in this episode were simple. Buddy Holly was a kind, gentle, hardworking kid who left a pregnant wife behind because he chartered a plane to do his laundry. Little Richard was a genius and a deeply tormented man who spent his life trying to reconcile 2 things about himself that the world could not let him hold at once. Jerry Lee Lewis was one of the most electrifying performers in American music history, and a man who married his 13-year-old cousin. Chuck Berry invented a huge portion of the language of rock and roll, and was a man with a long history of behavior that we should not look away from. Elvis was the king, and a kid from Tupelo who never really got to grow up. Alan Freed gave the music its name and lost everything for it. Dick Clark testified politely and kept his empire. The business that ate them was full of people who loved the music and people who only loved the money, and most of them were the same people on different days. Anyone who tells you the story in one direction, anyone who tells you that the founders were heroes who were betrayed or that the industry was a clean machine that protected the public from a few bad actors, has decided in advance which person in the room they care about, and stopped asking questions about everyone else. Those are the questions we ask on Everything is Great, because nothing about the story is simple. And the music we love almost did not survive the people who made it, and almost did not survive the people who replaced them. The only reason we still have it is that some kids in Liverpool went to the trouble of buying the records that nobody in America would play. This episode is dedicated to Buddy Holly and the glasses that outlasted him. I'm Lauren with Everything is Gray. Thanks for listening. This episode has been written, edited, and produced by Lauren Bregetzer.